Welcome back to a new episode of Podcast on the Brink, Wednesday, October 4th. Big news on Tuesday, Indiana and Kentucky are going to resume their regular season series in men's basketball. It's been since 2016 that these programs have met in the NCAA tournament in Des Moines, Iowa. And to help us, I guess, break down the news and the importance of this series getting resumed, Rick Bozich of WDRB is back on the show. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me.
What is the significance in you've covered college basketball in this area of the country for a long time. You've seen a lot of Indiana, Kentucky games over the years. I know this is something that's been talked about by fans ever since the Christian Watford shot went in and the series kind of was canceled at that point. What's the significance, I guess, for both fan bases to have this series back on the schedule beginning in the 2025-26 season?
I think there's a lot of reasons. One is there's a lot of history there between the two states. Not only have they played against each other, I think, 59 times or 57 times or whatever it's been through the years, but for a long time there was also a great rivalry in the Kentucky-Indiana high school basketball series. Players from both sides knew each other, competed against each other. You're talking about programs that have combined to win, 13 national championships. Kentucky has 8, I believe, and Indiana has 5. Programs that have historic coaches who've been known throughout the game, with Kentucky having Rupp and Pitino and Calipari, and Indiana having Branch McCracken and Coach Knight. And you've got fan bases that are engaged with each other. They enjoy going back and forth at each other, bragging about which program is better, bragging about their status in the world. And I think if you step away from the two fan bases these days in college basketball TV programming, there really aren't that many games that can grab attention outside of the regional area. But Kentucky and Indiana will be, at least initially, when they finally come back and play each other. It'll be a national story, and it's good. It's good for the it's good for the brand, both brands, in my opinion.
This was something that I think a lot of people thought may not happen as long as John Calipari was the coach at Kentucky. Obviously, he had a friendship with Tom Crean, had a friendship with Archie Miller, but now Mike Woodson takes over. Was there something different with this situation? A lot of people have commented that maybe Calipari disagreed to this because he doesn't think he's going to be maybe at Kentucky by the time they actually have to come to Assembly Hall. But is there something different maybe about this time around that made him willing, in your eyes, to put the series back on the schedule? Because there's no mistaking that Indiana wanted to play this game, and Kentucky was obviously the school maybe holding out for I guess the arrangement in terms of the games being played where they wanted them to be played, and Indiana had to agree to that.
Right. I think one is time. It's been 12 years since the game in Bloomington that upset Coach Calipari and just had him decide he wasn't coming back to Bloomington anymore, and it led to the end of the series. I really don't think Mike Woodson has a better relationship with him than Tom Crean did, or even Archie Miller, so I'm not sure how much that was, other than Mike Woodson might have been more agreeable to going along with Coach Calipari's terms. But I think the biggest factor was, and this plays into a conversation I had on Tuesday with Scott Dolson, is that Scott Dolson worked at it and developed a relationship with Mitch Barnhart, the Kentucky athletic director. And I think those two guys, while not really competing head-to-head in the same way that basketball coaches compete head-to-head, were able to step back and look at the broader picture of it and say, this is the thing that's good for both schools in bigger picture type things, and a way needs to be found to have it get done. And, in many ways you could make the argument that Indiana gave in more and gave up more and was more willing to go along with Kentucky's terms to do that. And for that, I give, I know some Indiana fans are critical of that, but I think sometimes you have to step away from the selfish reasons behind it and say what's good for the overall health of college basketball and the health of the program, and say, yeah, that's it, and move forward.
So do you think that what Indiana agreed to was the only way it was going to get done, and is that why the games are situated and kind of scheduled the way that they are, with Rupp Arena first, then Lucas Oil, then Rupp Arena, then Assembly Hall again? Was that I don't necessarily know the answer to the question, but I'm curious if you think that's the only way Kentucky was going to agree to do this.
I don't know. I mean, it sure seems that way. I mean, if you look at the main points of negotiation or conflict, A, Kentucky got the first home game, Indiana got the very last one. B, Kentucky got 2 home games, and Indiana got one in Bloomington and the other one in Lucas Oil. And then there's actually another year. It's not even happening next year. It's happening the year after that. So you would think that would be the case. But in the end, I mean, that's the kind of stuff that says why the rivalry needs to be back. And it's so important because people are arguing about that stuff. It matters. And so, when Indiana played Kansas, the first game was at Kansas, the second game was at Bloomington. Nobody said anything about that. But in this case, because it's Kentucky, people are complaining about it. And, in the end, it's going to come down to show that you're competitive on the court and win games. And that's how let's be honest, Kentucky's been a better basketball program than Indiana over the last however many years since Coach Cal's been there. And Indiana has some work to do to build up its brand. And if this is part of one of the steps they have to take to get there, then that's the way it is. They have to, Indiana has to earn the national respect back that they've lost over the last however many years you want to put it.
Are you surprised at just how willing Mike Woodson's been to take on these type of challenges so early in his tenure? Last season they played Kansas, obviously on the road. They played Arizona on a neutral court. This season, playing UConn up in New York, that's not going to be easy. They could have to play Texas or Louisville the next game, then Kansas at home, Auburn down in Atlanta. He's scheduling like, a guy that wants to kind of get back on that stage. I guess the 2-part question: are you surprised at just how willing he's been able to play these games? And the second part, I guess, is for Indiana to get that respect back, they need to start winning some of these games at some point. Last year they played Arizona and Kansas and lost convincingly to both of those teams. These are the games that Indiana, if they want to get back on that national stage, has to start winning, right?
Yeah, they do. I've been surprised and then not surprised. I've been surprised from the standpoint of it's not what coaches normally do now. Most coaches schedule like they're afraid to take a loss. I think we can make that point about Tom Crean and Archie Miller in the non-conference. They scheduled a lot of games, didn't really want to go on the road and play people a lot of times. Mike Woodson, comes from the NBA, where you don't make your own schedule. The league makes your own schedule, and you make it however, he has a chance to make it however he wants to make it. And he also comes from an era where Indiana was one of the best 2 or 3 programs in the country when he played there, and wasn't afraid to play anybody. And Bob Knight played a tough schedule. And so I think he's smart enough to realize that if you really think, if you want to sell yourself to recruits as a top 10 program, you got to play this kind of schedule. And I don't think it's coincidental that you can say the first game is in 2025. That'll be the freshman year for guys like Jalen Harrelson, Trent Sisley, Brian Mullins, and Xavier, is it Robinson? Is that the kid's name at Lawrence North? That you can go to in-state kids in Indiana and say, hey, you know what? You can be on the team that starts the Kentucky rivalry back if you come to Indiana. That's a recruiting chip that you can play with those people. So I think Woodson, he doesn't think the way some of these other guys think. He's older. He knows he's got to get it done at a faster pace. He can't have a 5-year building program. And so he's not worried about taking a loss. He's worried about doing some of the things you have to do to give your program a little bit of juice again.
You were at Media Day a couple of weeks ago in Bloomington. What were your biggest takeaways from just talking to some of the players? And obviously there's a lot of intrigue around this Indiana team. a lot of players are gone from last year, but they bring in a lot of talented pieces, and they've been picked, I think, anywhere from fourth or fifth in the Big Ten down to seventh or eighth in most of the preseason magazines. But what were your main takeaways from media day?
Yeah, I mean, just looking at him and with some of the people I've talked to since then who've been at practice, it's a longer, more athletic team, a lot more size, I think, at a lot of different positions. Obviously, considerably less proven than the last couple of years. I think people will generally underestimate how difficult it's going to be to replace Trace Jackson Davis. They're rarely are 4-year players at a school. That Indiana had the security blanket last year of knowing that Trace Jackson Davis could keep them in a lot of games just with the way he played. It's going to have to be different this year. And 2 or 3 guys are going to have to really develop and step forward as legitimate players on both ends of the court. And I think that there's going to be some growing pains this year because a lot of those guys are inexperienced. A lot of them haven't ever played together before. But, if everything goes right, I think it can be a really good team. The biggest concern I have looking at that team is that the depth at guard. If anything happens to Xavier Johnson or Trey Galloway, it could be a big issue because all they have behind them is C.J. Gunn, who's unproven, and then you go down to Gabe Cupps and Anthony Leal. I don't expect Newton to play this year, considering he was there with the brace on his knee and walking around with crutches and what he's gone through for the last 2 years. So just a lot of positive vibes because I think the team has a lot of self-confidence and belief in their talent, but it's unproven talent. So until you actually see them on the court, it's hard. They're a hard team to really get a handle on how good they're going to be, in my mind, because it's hard to replace 4 starters. And I mean, we all know Woodson and those guys started after Johnson was hurt. They all started every game, right?
Yeah, there's not been much change or flexibility in the starting lineup. That's one of the main things we've seen under Woodson for the first 2 years. One thing I think a lot of people are curious about is the starting lineup, and I think a lot of people have just assumed that it's going to be the 2 guards you talked about, Johnson and Galloway, and then Mbako, Renew, and Ware. Do you think that's realistic to play that type of size at the 3, 4, and 5? Obviously, it can create some matchup problems, teams having to guard you, but then you also look at some of the teams that are playing smaller lineups with smaller 3s and maybe some smaller 4s, and you wonder how that lineup's going to work defensively.
Yeah, I mean, it's a legitimate question, but I mean, if you didn't go that size, I guess you'd have to put Gunn in and play, or the other guys that you're talking about playing up front would be Banks, who's another big guy too, or I think Sparks will mainly come off the bench. I think Walker will mainly come off the bench. So that's going to be one of the questions: how mobile are those guys going to be defensively? And Mbako is a freshman. There's not a lot of freshmen that are great defenders. He's going to have to figure it out real quick in terms of what's required. And that's going to. It's got pluses and minuses. It's got pluses, and the other teams have to adjust to you, but it's got minuses. And can your team do some of the stuff defensively that Mike Woodson wants them to do?
Xavier Johnson obviously coming into the season with a lot of expectations. I caught some flack from IU fans with where Dylan and I had him ranked on our preseason Big Ten players list. We had him at 16 in the league, which is just outside of that third team all Big Ten range. But there were some other Big Ten point guards that I think Indiana fans think that maybe he's on the same level with, like a Boo Buie, a Jameer Young, Ace Baldwin at Penn State. Where do you view, I guess, Xavier Johnson just in terms of Big Ten point guards entering the season, and what is his importance to Indiana this season in terms of being able to succeed and win?
He's probably the most important player in the team, in my opinion, because he's going to be the leader. I think if he can play, to his best more than he plays, at some of the games where we've seen him where he's not at his best, that really stretches the ceiling for the team because he's their best on the ball defender for sure. And we saw that last year. That was a big problem late in the season against, teams like Miami for sure. he's the guy that makes the other team uncomfortable. B, he's the emotional leader because of the way he plays. He's very feisty on the court. He's got to learn to control that feistiness. He did a better job of it, I thought, last year before he got hurt, but he's got to do an even better job of it and staying out of foul trouble and not getting technical fouls and those kinds of things. And B, I think people see he showed, I thought, towards the end of the 2022 season, he's a dangerous three-point shooter that you have to respect. His shot doesn't look textbook, but it went in. And the other thing, I mean, he became a deadly point guard on the pick and roll with Trace Jackson Davis, and he's going to have to develop that kind of relationship with Khalil Ware or whoever else they run the pick and roll with. So to me, he's the most critical player on the team. He's got to stay healthy, and I don't know enough about all the other Big Ten guys. Boo Boo, he always looks like he has a great game against Indiana, but I think Xavier Johnson at his best is as good as any point guard in the Big Ten. And he's a sixth-year guy. I mean, there's a lot of value there. I mean, he's seen it all. He's been through it all. This is his last chance. Didn't have to come back this year, but he did. I'm not really sure what his reasons are. His reasons to improve his pro draft stock, I don't know. Or his reasons to come back to win championships, I don't know. But it's very valuable to have a sixth-year guard who's played as much basketball as he had, because remember, he actually played more than the minimum last year. He's only back because the NCAA gave him a waiver. It's hard to imagine there's a player in college basketball or in the Big Ten who has more experience than Xavier Johnson.
Yeah, he was on the ACC all-freshman team at Pittsburgh with Zion Williamson, so that kind of lets you know how long he's been around.
He's a super competitive guy. I mean, the thing about Xavier Johnson is, you know, when he goes too far, he goes too far. But you don't ever watch a game and say, "Man, he dogged it tonight," or "He looked flat." I mean, very rarely. Emotion is a very important part of his game. Energy is a big part of his game, as it is with Galloway. And those two guys, as the co-captains and as the starting backcourt, and their style of play can be tone setters for this team because they have other guys. I mean, Mike Woodson's talked about it. Khalil Ware, the knock on him is he doesn't bring it every night. So, I mean, those guys will be in charge of making those guys bring it every night.
One of the things I look forward to most about this time of year is Ken Palm coming out with his preseason rankings, going through the preseason magazines like Blue Ribbon, and then obviously getting to the first AP Top 25 preseason poll, which you've been a voter in for a long time, and I know that you're starting to do your research now. When you kind of look at the top of college basketball entering this season, is it just Purdue and Michigan State really from the Big Ten that are legitimate, probably top 25 teams entering the season? And as you kind of begin to comb through these lists and come up with your preseason top 25, who are the two or three teams that maybe are continuing to come up over and over as you look through all these projections?
I mean, Kansas, UConn, Purdue, Michigan State is another one. Duke, North Carolina is another one. Kentucky, but a little bit lower than they normally are. Texas, those are Gonzaga. I mean, it's a lot of Villanova, even though I'm a little bit surprised by that, considering how ordinary they were last year. A lot of people are giving St. John's credit. I saw that Jim Boeheim said the other day that they're definitely a top 20 team. But I think it's fair to say Michigan State and Purdue are the two best teams in the Big Ten. Purdue's got the National Player of the Year back, plus almost all of his supporting cast, and a track record of always being good in the Big Ten. And Michigan State's got a lot of returning players back, plus probably the best freshman class in the Big Ten. And Izzo, I think they had their media day yesterday or Monday, and he said he really liked this team, and he compared Jeremy Fears to Mateen Cleaves, and he's embracing, Michigan State football stinks this year, so he kind of feels like he's got to entertain the Michigan State fans. He's embracing it. He's not running from it. So I think I'll have both those teams in my top five. Not sure I'll rank another Big Ten team, but by the end of the year, I'm sure there'll be one or two Big Ten teams who are good enough to be ranked, and Indiana could well be one of them. I'm not going to rank them at the start of the year because I think there's too many questions with a team that lost all the players that they lost right off the start. I mean, that's I think the tendency is to value or under appreciate how much they lost. I mean, they lost a lot, man. Guys who did a lot, and even though there was a lot of criticism of Miller Kopp and Bryce Thompson, I mean, they did a lot of good things, especially on the defensive end. That the guys who replace them might end up being better, but I'm not sure they're going to be better from day one.
Which other Big Ten teams are you most interested in watching entering the season? I'm going through my exercise now. You know, obviously it's content for the site, writing a preview of each Big Ten team, but it also helps me familiarize myself with all the rosters, and it's become harder to do every year now with all of the transfer portal action. And you mentioned Michigan State. One of the incredible things about their roster this season is they didn't get a single player from the transfer portal. They basically just brought all their players back and brought in some freshmen. And I think that's one of the harder things now when you are trying to pick the league standings, is not only are you trying to figure out which players are going to take a leap forward, but you're also wondering how all these transfers are going to fit into their respective teams and how you can project a guy coming from, a mid or a low major and what they're going to do in the Big Ten. So I'm just curious if there's any couple of Big Ten teams that you're when these games start up in a month or so, you're going to be curious to see how they actually look when they get on the court.
I'd say Maryland, because I respect Kevin Willard as a coach. I know him from when he was here with Rick Pitino. I like the way his team, they overperformed last year. His teams were always hard to play against when he was at Seton Hall, and he's gotten some good players to add to his veteran roster. I'd say Rutgers, because I think Steve Peichel has proved he deserves respect. And although he's lost a lot of guys, in the past he's lost guys, and he replaces them with guys we've never heard of. This is really the first year that he's in on, Dylan Harper and the other guy who's already committed to him, top level recruits. But he wins with guys that fit his system. Those two for sure. If I had to pick a third one, third or fourth would be Illinois, because Underwood usually finds guys out of the portal that he can win with, and Iowa, because McCaffrey has proven over time that no matter who he loses, he finds guys who can score. They're not going to be great on defense. They're not going to do much in the tournament, but they're going to be hard to play because they're going to have guys who can shoot threes and score and try and beat you that way. So those, and Wisconsin, maybe. I don't know. Don't they got a lot of their guys back?
I think they brought back Tyler Wall, Stephen Crowell, Chucky Hepburn, Esigian, and then they brought in, which may be one of the more interesting transfers into the league, AJ Storr comes in, I believe from St. John's, after having a really solid freshman season there and playing in an up-tempo system. Comes in to Wisconsin. I think he's from the Midwest and kind of maybe gives them a little bit of a different dimension to what you're used to seeing from Wisconsin basketball. So I read some comments recently from Greg Gard in terms of him being willing to embrace the system, but it'll just be different seeing a guy that likes to get up and down the court, play with Wisconsin, but might be something that they need, because they kind of ran it back last year with a lot of those guys and only got to the NIT. And I think there's some pressure on Greg Gard to get back to the tournament this year, because there's people up there. They look at what Bo Ryan did for such a long time in Madison, and they say, well, Greg Gard's been pretty good, but he's not been to that level. And I think Wisconsin expects to make the tournament every year. So they're another team, I think. And Ohio State's another one that I've kind of looked at a lot, because last year Chris Holtmann got a lot of flack for missing the tournament. They bring back a decent nucleus, bring in probably the second best recruiting class in the Big Ten behind Michigan State and some transfers. So this is kind of going back to what I was speaking to earlier in terms of projecting the Big Ten. There's just so many teams after Michigan State and Purdue with so many question marks that it's really hard to figure out. You only look at maybe Minnesota as a team that is for sure going to be at the bottom, and then even Penn State. They've got a new coach, but I think Mike Rhodes won at a pretty high level at VCU. He brings his best player from VCU, who's the A-10 player of the year, and Ace Baldwin. Brings in a couple transfers from North Carolina, brings in the big guy, Wahab, who played at, I believe, at Georgetown, Maryland, then back at Georgetown. Now he's at Penn State. So I think from 3 to 12 in the league, it can be super competitive. I think that's one thing that makes the Big Ten maybe a little bit more fun to watch than like the ACC or the SEC every year in those leagues. I feel like there's two or three teams that are for sure at the bottom and going to get buried. But in the Big Ten, I feel like there's a team besides maybe Minnesota. I think everybody on a given night is going to be competitive.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, you got a lot of, we've seen it over the years, just a lot of games in the Big Ten when you go on the road and play. If you don't play very well, you will get beat. We've seen it happen quite a bit, but from a lot of different teams, not just Indiana. So, yeah, I would agree with that. I think it's Purdue and Michigan State, and then a big mosh pit of teams after that, and probably maybe Nebraska. I'm not as convinced that Penn State will be that good, and Minnesota would be the other one towards the bottom of the league. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Final question. What are fair expectations for Indiana fans to have on this season? Obviously, getting to the tournament in the first 2 years for Mike Woodson was a significant accomplishment after what happened under Archie Miller. I think the expectation now, I guess, if you ask Mike Woodson, he wants to be in the tournament every year. Is that the expectation for this team to get back to the tournament and just see how far they can go?
Yeah. Considering 8 or 9 teams from the Big Ten make the tournament every year, you should be able to finish in the top 8 or 9 every year. So I'd say, yeah, that is where the expectation should be. If you don't make the tournament, then that, it's like, what have you really accomplished over your first 3 years? Getting to the round of 32 once. I think you should put that expectation on yourself where you make the tournament every year. And, I don't know if it's this year or next year or whenever, but the expectation goes up to Sweet 16 or better, because that's by year 4, Crean went to the Sweet 16 in back-to-back seasons. So, yeah, that's what the way it should be.
Well, thanks for coming on this week's episode of Podcast on the Brink, especially on short notice. I don't think any of us had. I know the Indiana-Kentucky series have been something that had been discussed for a while, but I don't know why a Tuesday in October was the day they picked to make the announcement, but that's when they did. And I appreciate you coming on the show this week to help us break that all down and also talk some Big Ten.
All right. Enjoyed. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, as always, for listening to Podcast on the Brink. If you enjoy the show, please leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts. Leave us a rating on Spotify, and we'll be back soon with another episode of Podcast on the Brink.